All right, maybe let's begin. There's already a couple people in here, so maybe I'll get started. Welcome to the frameworkless.js course. My name is Mike, also known as Vive. I'm Timothy Vive online. I've been a web dev for about 10 years, so I've done PHP, Ruby. I mostly do JavaScript now, so Node.js and front-end JavaScript. I'm a digital nomad, so I travel. So right now I'm in Vietnam. So if there's any power cuts or anything, I might go out for a little bit, but I'll do my best to stay online. Yeah, and I'm here in the co-working space. So also if there's some random noises, please excuse that. Yeah, so I guess what we're going to be learning is, why don't I switch the screen to my actual video feed here. Uh, So you probably either signed up from my website or maybe heard about this course or saw it in the Telegram group. And maybe I'll just tell you a bit about it. So it's essentially we're going to be building a Node.js application in the course, and we're going to be doing it in a like no framework sort of way. So there's lots of frameworks out there you can use that are actually really great for a lot of different projects. They work for a lot of stuff, but they're not for everybody, and they're not for all use cases. And so this course is kind of for someone who knows what a framework is, probably, and knows a little bit about JavaScript. That's kind of a requirement. I could go into teaching the actual JavaScript language as well. I've done that before in a classroom setting, but I just don't think we have the scope for it in this course. So maybe I'll create another course for that. But at the moment, we're just going to be focusing on building a web app. And so this is going to be about 6 or 7 different streams, and I'm going to record all the streams and post them so you can view them anytime. And the whole thing is that, yeah, every time we finish, so every week or every time we finish one part of it, we're going to add another sort of layer on top of the application we're building. So the goal is that at the end, we're going to actually launch a real product, and that's actually really exciting. So let's find out more about that. So why do this? Because lots of people have really great ideas for a new product. So maybe something in your own life, something that's a pain in your own life that you want to sort of overcome. Maybe you already use a piece of software and you don't really like it as much. And that is what this is for. So what we're going to learn is like a really fast and iterative way of building. And because frameworks kind of go into your and complicate your life a little bit, this is more about just writing it fast and lean using just vanilla JavaScript and Node.js. So we're going to be doing it in modern JavaScript. We're going to be using Node.js 12, which is the current version at the time of recording. And we're going to be going through and creating basically a web app using that. And yeah, you're going to have to learn, or you probably already know JavaScript, but learning a framework on top of it can also complicate things for you. So what we're going to do is just learn it without the frameworks. And also, at the end of this course, you're going to have all of this boilerplate code that you wrote for this other product, remind us, I'll get to that in a second, that you can use for any other project. So you can basically have a bootstrap of your app in no time as a result of doing this. And what we're going to be building as part of this course, as part of this learning procedure, is Remindist. So Remindist is a very simple product. You can send an email to yourself in the future. So it's already kind of live. You can look at it yourself. You enter your email address. You tell it when you want to receive the email. So let's say on the 8th or something. And you type a message. So hello. And now this message will be sent to me in one day. And yeah, so that's what we're going to build. And by the time you're done, you're going to know how to send emails. You're going to know how to create an HTTP server, how to serve dynamic content, all that stuff. All right, so let's get started. So before we dig into the actual code, let me just go through the small boilerplate about Node.js. Node.js, we're going to be using Node.js 12. So please make sure you install that version of Node or something also recent, like maybe Node 11 will work as well. Node Version Manager, which the link is in the slides here, but you can also Google search it. It's a really great way to manage your Node version. So I would highly recommend that you go ahead and use Node Version Manager to manage your Node versions. So assuming that you have Node installed, let's actually get started, dig right in. The first thing we want to do is, of course, we want to create a directory for ourselves to work in. So I have this framework list directory. So I'm going to create a remind this folder, and that's going to be the project that I'm going to be working on will be in that folder. And then the next thing I need to do is run this npm init command. So some of you may be familiar with this already. It's essentially npm is the package manager for the JavaScript ecosystem. And this creates a package.json file with, most importantly for us at the moment, your package dependencies. So we've just created a package.json file. So let's open up this folder in a code editor. So I use VS Code, but you can use whatever you want. So yeah, we just generated this package.json file. And you see it's pretty bare bones, but that's fine. So now the next step is that we want to actually make this little application. So you might recognize this if you know JavaScript at all. If you do this, all you're doing is essentially testing that JavaScript is running on your machine. It doesn't actually do anything. So yeah, we can go ahead and test this to make sure that it's working. So we'll create an app.js file and run it. So node app.js. So you see it's running. So everything's set up properly for us to work. So this course, I'm really big on this, is I don't want to create any useless boilerplate that you're never going to use, any useless examples like counters and things like that exist in a lot of other tutorials, but I found them personally when I did tutorials a little bit frustrating because those are useless examples. They don't really apply to what I usually tend to do. So what we're going to be doing is this is the last piece of useless code that we're going to write. No more after this. Everything else will actually be for the remind.ist app. So it'll all be for that. And so no more of this like sort of examples like console log statements and things like that. So the first thing I would like to direct you, you don't have to do this part of it, but I would highly recommend you use a module called NodeMon or something like it. What NodeMon does is it's for the development environment, and it essentially allows you to watch for file changes. So every time you save a file, it will automatically relaunch your server. So you don't have to go into your command line, quit out of that, and then restart the app every time you made a change. So to do that, we're going to install it here in our project, in our newly spawned project. Now notice that I install it as a dev dependency. If you're not familiar with what that does, I will show you in 1 second. It installs the package in a dev dependencies object instead of the main dependencies object. And a lot of hosting environments essentially will not make the dev dependencies modules available. So this is only for you to develop locally. This is something to help you on your local development environment. So any modules like that go in there. So NodeMon is a great one. And then here's a start script. So the package.json file has a scripts object. So you'll see there's already a test command in there. And the start job will allow us to start up NodeMon with an inspector instance built in or launched. And I'll get to that in another episode, but it's a great way to debug your code. And the -e flag tells it to listen to changes made to JavaScript files, HTML files, and so forth. So all of these different file types that we're going to be using in our app. So we should listen to all of these. And then lastly, the last parameter says to start the app.js file. So if from now on, all we have to do is do npm run start, and our app will start. Now notice here, I'll show you, if I make any changes to this app.js file, let's say remove this exclamation point, the app will automatically restart here. So that's the usefulness of this. It's really great to do this because then you don't have to worry about restarting. It's one less step for you. So that's just something I recommend you do. And the next thing we need to do is we need to install a way to handle environment variables easy. An environment variable, if you're not familiar, it's a way to store a piece of configuration that might be, well, it could be like a port number, for example. That's what we're going to be using it for. But if you're using, for example, if your app connects to Facebook, you might store the Facebook credentials and API keys in the env as an environment variable. And the point of that is that you don't want to hard code things into your app. If you start hard coding things, then you're going to end up with potentially security leaks. You're going to end up with a badly configured application, and it won't be very portable because if you already set up one environment with, for example, one port number, and you want to launch multiple instances on the same server, you might have trouble with that because the port number is hard coded. So yeah, let's just go ahead and install this module. So .env allows us to easily manage the environment variables in our application. And notice we're also installing it as a dev dependency because this treatment isn't necessary. This module is not necessary in a production environment. So the production environment will have its own way of managing environment variables. You won't need it. But locally, you do want to do this. So here we've installed the .env package. And the next step to using .env is to create a .env file. And we want to specify that we want to use the port number 1234 for our app. And that'll be the port that we develop from. So when we access it from our browser, we'll be using localhost 1234. So to use the .env module, the easiest way is to include it as the first thing in your app. So that's on line 2 here in my example code. So let's see, let's go to app.js. So we'll replace the boilerplate stuff. And then let's go through this code. This is actually the simplest version of a HTTP server using Node.js as HTTP server. So as you see here, oops, I think I'm on the wrong slide. Yeah, here we go. So we're using the HTTP module that comes with Node instead of a framework like Express to do this. You can read the docs for the HTTP module on the nodejs.org website if you're interested, but it's actually fairly straightforward. And we're going to be using a very small portion of it. We're going to be using the create server method and nothing else really. So that's what we're doing on line 2 here. We're grabbing the create server, destructure importing the create server method from the HTTP module. Then we're creating a variable called server, and we're essentially using this create server that we imported to create a responder function. A responder function is something that receives any request made by the person's browser or API or whatever. And that response needs to be interpreted and needs to send back something valid back to the browser. So it takes 2 arguments, this main function. And don't worry, by the way, if you're like, what the hell are you talking about? Because we'll go into this a bit more in detail. But essentially, the request object is what you start with. It's what you received from the browser. And the response is what you send back to the browser, the user's browser. And notice that all we're doing here is we're sending back using this end method some plain text. It's just a JavaScript string that says, look, this is a response. And so it's a really simple HTTP server. And in order for that server to be bound to a port on a computer, would be to use the .listen method. So yeah, we initialize the server variable here, and we are going to launch it using this. And of course, we do have a number on line 4 here, the port variable. And if we're using environment variables, then we require .env at the top, and then our port variable actually comes from an environment variable. So here's what the code looks like. And all we have to do in order to run it is run npm run start, which starts up our nodemon instance. And so if you go to localhost 1234, here is our HTTP server serving the static text that we specified in our responder function, right? So we're telling the response to return this text, and here it is in the browser. Okay, so moving along. And maybe it's a good moment to reflect on what we just did. We created the simplest version of an HTTP server possible using Node.js. Again, it doesn't really do a whole lot besides just returning a response, but we're going to build on this functionality in the next few minutes to make it actually do something much more useful. But this is the fundamental building block of any application that you'll see. So a lot of the frameworks that you might use, like for example, express.js or happy.js or Koa, use the same methodology under the hood. So they use the HTTP module out of the Node.js standard library in order to create the server for you. So we're just cutting out that middleman layer and doing it ourselves. So let's talk about this responder. So we pass the argument into the create server, and this argument is what we can refer to as a responder. So a responder, like I said, receives a request and returns a response. That's what it does. Depending on what the request contains in it. For example, a request might contain the URL of what page you're trying to load. So for instance, if you're trying to load /about.html, you obviously want to serve the about.html file and not some other file. You want to make that relevant to what you're actually requesting. So the response obviously needs to reflect what was received. So let's get started and structure our app a little bit. So this is kind of a complex set of steps, but we're going to be using a construct called an initializer. So an initializer is essentially, if you're familiar with Ruby on Rails, you might understand this concept. But an initializer is essentially something that starts up a process within your app. So in this case, we're going to use the HTTP. We're going to put the HTTP.js initializer in here. And what that will do is start up our server, HTTP server. The next thing we need to do is we need to serve static files from somewhere, because our job this time around is to create a static file server. So we're going to create a public folder, and from that public folder, we are going to serve the static files. One note on that, we, of course, are going to be serving some static files. So if you go to frameworkless.js.org/course/1, that's kind of the landing page for this particular course. So on here, you'll have access to this public folder.zip file. And this file has a bunch of starter content that you can use for your public folder. So it's got an HTTP, it's got some HTTP stuff in it. Here, if you open up this file. So it's got some fab icons, it's got a sample app.js file, it's got an error.html file, and so forth. So this is just a good starter for your public folder to get you started. So feel free to download this file just to save yourself some time. But yeah, so the public folder will just be called public, and it will reside in the root of our directory, or in the root of our project. And the last thing, we're going to sort of move some of the logic that we're using for static files into the lib directory. So we'll create a lib directory, short for library, and inside we'll create a responder.js file. Now responder.js will contain the response logic for our static files, for example. So we'll import this into our application, and then we will use it from there. All right, so the last thing we need to do is create a constants file, config/constants. So we'll create a directory called config, and in here we'll create a file called constants.js. And now, what to put in those files? Well, first of all, in the constants, we want to specify what file types we want to be able to be served in our application. We don't want to serve just any file, because that might potentially create a security risk for our app. So we are going to specify what files we want to be able to serve. So the extension, for example, images here are all in here. So JPEGs, GIFs, PNGs, and so forth. CSS and JS files, and of course, TXTs, HTMLs, and so forth. So all of this stuff will be servable, and the reason we put it into this constants.js file is because it's nice to have in one place some of this logic, some of this configuration logic. So anywhere where we need to access this particular array, we will import static extensions from the constants file. And now the next part, this is going to be a little complicated. We're going to be working with the file system. So Node.js has a module called FS, and FS has gone through a number of changes over the years. So actually, if you Google tutorials on how to use it, you might actually find a whole bunch of contradictory material, because it's changed a lot since it was first launched. And the whole point of FS is to access either files or directories on the file system. But this is not the simplest process in general. So oftentimes, the API for it's changed quite a bit. So in Node.js 12, and I think maybe 11, I'm not sure, but the promises version of the FS library has been rolled out. So that's the syntax we're going to be using, because it's the most recent, and also because JavaScript for years now has been moving towards promises in general in order to manage control flow for the application. And so we're going to use promises because they're just more convenient to use. So we'll go ahead and do that. But first, I'd like to walk through this code. So this might be a little bit of a surprise to you, because even if you used the file system before, and you use some of the other old functionality like the .read file function, this might be a little bit different to you. So the first thing we do is, of course, we import the open method of the FS library. Now notice here that I'm specifying that I want the promises version of open. You can read the documentation for it if you're interested. It's on the nodejs.org website under documentation. Just make sure you look up Node.js version 12. But the point is that the promises here, this is a special set of APIs and functions. So just make sure you grab the .promises version of that. The next thing we do is we import our static extensions variable. Now you'll notice from before that was the thing we created here with all the file types. So these are going to be the whitelisted file types that we are allowing our app to serve. The next thing is this is the jumble that will actually do the magic thing of serving the static files. So why don't I copy this into my text editor, and I'll walk you through this a little bit. So the serve static file is an asynchronous function. If you're not familiar with these are also a fairly recent construct. But essentially what this is it creates a promise out of a regular function. But yeah, I would highly recommend that if you've never heard of this, give it a read through, because it might actually save you a lot of code and a lot of pain and suffering if you're just using standard promises or callback-driven code. So it might be a good idea to do that. So yeah, the serve static file is a function. It's asynchronous, and the first set of arguments here, you see I've deconstructed the object that it will receive. It takes a file, an extension, and a status code. So we'll get around to filling in those arguments later, but just know that file represents the path to the file. Extension is the file's extension that was requested. And the status code is a way to overwrite the HTTP status code that we respond with. If you're not familiar with status codes, I suggest you give it a read through, but it's pretty easy. You can just Google it. But essentially, anything that is a 400 plus 400 to 499 is an error, and also 500 and up is also an error. And anything that's not that is a correct response. So, for example, the way that you would normally respond to a request is with a 200 status code. So anyways, this is a whole system that lets browsers know what happened as a result of the request. So if you send back an error code, then it knows, oh, something went wrong, and it can give that message back to the user appropriately. But anyways, back to the file system. So you recall here we started the open method. So because it uses promises, we can use this await logic here. And this is only available inside the async function if you're not familiar with this. But yeah, so we're awaiting the opening of the file that is being requested. So we know that we want a file out of the public directory because this is a static file. This is going to be a static file. And then the second parameter is we're specifying that we only want the ability to read. This is quite important because you never want to overload permissions for anything that you do. Always err on the side of caution. So in this case, we don't need write permissions. We only need read. So we specify that we're only asking for read permissions. And notice that there's two steps here. There's the open and there's the read file. In a lot of different programming languages, Node.js, and I believe also in some instances of like the different shells that you can use, opening a file is different than reading it. So in this case here as well, the file handle variable holds a reference to a file on the file system. And then the static file variable here is the actual content of that file. So we are asking the Node.js to open the file on line 12, and on line 13, we're asking it to read it. So after this line is done executing, number 13, it basically has the contents of that file, and we can serve them to the user. Notice that I put the whole thing into a try block. In asynchronous functions, it's kind of imperative that you manage errors correctly. So if you basically are, if you encounter an error of some kind, like for instance, if a file is not found, then you need to be able to respond with an error to the person requesting it. But because these await functions are actually promises, and in Node.js, if a promise is rejected, but it's not, the error isn't dealt with, caught, in other words, Node.js will actually crash the process. So that's the behavior of Node.js. And so for that reason, we want to avoid that situation. So always, whenever you're running code that sits in await, at some point you want to be able to catch the error. And in this case, we want to catch it in this function here, because really there's a few possible errors that could happen here. For example, we could encounter a problem where the file is not found or the file isn't readable. So in both those cases, we should return a response. And we're going to respond with a not found error instead of just, responding with a blank or something like that. So that is what the catch block does. So try attempts to execute all the code, and as soon as it encounters a problem, it will throw an error. And this catch block here that follows the try catches the error. So first of all, we want to console log the error, because we want to be able to see it in our logs if there's any errors. And secondly, we want to rethrow the error, because, but we don't want to rethrow any error. We don't want to rethrow any kind of FS module errors, because those actually don't belong in error output to the user. The user doesn't need to see complex errors thrown by Node.js. The only thing that the user should be concerned with is that the file cannot be retrieved. And in this case, we're just going to return not found. So that's what we're going to do. And then the last thing is this finally block here. So the control flow goes like this. So you try. If there's an error, you catch. And then after the catch is done, you execute the finally. Finally gets executed whether the try succeeded or not, or whether the error went into catch. So finally is a great way to kind of finish things up, regardless of whether an error happened or not. Excuse me. So here we are actually closing, you'll notice the file handle. You might ask yourself, well, why bother to do this? Well, because if you open up a whole bunch of files with your application, it's actually kind of good behavior to close them again. Because these file handles can like soak up a lot of resources. You could end up with various types of errors in your application if you don't close the file handles. Because if you imagine, like, if you launch your app and 1,000 people open your app, and every time they open the app, you serve a bunch of images, HTML pages, CSS style sheet, a JavaScript file, and so forth. And maybe each of those requests adds up to 10 different files that you're serving. So 10 times 1,000 is 10,000 requests. That's 10,000 open file handles on your machine. So those things add up quite quickly. So you want to be able to close the file handles whenever you are done with them. And this is just also good behavior in terms of any application. So make sure that you include this part. So finally, we'll close the file handle. And the last part is we've got this awesome function now written out. And all we need to do now is return it to anyone that is importing this module. So for that reason, we are doing this module exports, and then we're exporting the function that we created. The one thing I haven't gone through is this on line 7. So we are using the static extensions constant to check to make sure that the extension of the file that is being requested is within the scope of this static extension. So if anybody asks for a .exe file or something, that's not going to be returned. It's going to return a not found error. You might ask yourself, like, all of these potential error cases, why return a not found every single time? Well, I'll tell you why, because in any of these cases, the result is that the file can't be served back. So maybe there's a technical reason why your file is found, but it cannot be given back to the user. But does it really matter in the long run? It matters to you if you're debugging your app, but to the user it doesn't matter. So I find it's actually easier to just say, you know what, all of these types of errors will just generate not found errors in terms of the client side. All right, so we've written out this function, so let's save it. And okay. And finally, we need to include this logic somehow, this file serving logic, in our HTTP server. So right now our HTTP initializer is blank, but we want it to have some content. So here it is. Let me copy and paste it in, and I'll share this with you now. So the first thing we need to do is we need to import a port, or check to see if the port is set in the environment variables. Now, we already covered environment variables a little bit earlier, but maybe it's a nice idea to do this as the first thing in your file, so that's why we do it here. And what we're doing here is we're saying that if the port is not set, then require in the .env module. Because it's pretty safe to say that if this is being run and the port environment variable isn't set, that we're on a development environment. So in that case, we want to use our .env module. And then you'll notice that this is familiar. So we created that really simple HTTP server here. So we're just expanding on that functionality a bit. And here we're importing our serve static file. And this comes from, of course, the lib.responder that we just finished writing. And we need 2 variables to make this all work from our environment. That's the port and the app name. App name, you obviously don't need it, but that's something that I like to use because, yeah, just because. So we're going to call it remind.ist. And the magic, the meat of this function is essentially here being exported. So we create a server, just like we did before in our simple static example here. And here we do some logic. And I will go through this a little bit at length because, yeah, we need to. The only other things that we do is after the server is initialized, we do this .on functionality here. And so what happens is we're saying that the server, once it's launched, and on refers to an event. So whenever there's a request event happening, we should do this callback. So this callback essentially gives us a log of all of the requests made to our server. So you notice here we are specifying a date, and we are outputting into our log the current time, time and date, the method of the request, and the URL requested. Right? So this helps us debug application problems, figure out what people are looking up, and so forth. It's just a nice and useful thing to have. And then, of course, you'll probably recognize this here, the server.listen. So we're listening to the port number specified in the end file. And the only change I really made was this message has an app name in it, so that when you launch it, it'll say the environment variable value for app name, which is remind.ist. Okay, so let's go through this create server function mess here that we have created. You'll notice that I'm passing an asynchronous function into create server. This is allowed, so you can pass a promise in and it will still work. And you'll notice that I'm not importing just the request here. I'm only importing the URL. That's because I don't need any more data from the request. I only need the URL. Because this is a static file server at this moment, I don't actually need, for example, the method or anything like that. And then the next few lines here, just process the URL and determine what it is that I want to look up. So in the URL specification, whenever we have a dot, the final dot essentially specifies the file extension. So we know that if a dot is present in the URL, it's pretty safe to say that this person is requesting a static file, like a .gif or something like that. So that's what the dot signifies. And then we determine the extension by, first of all, figuring out we basically say if there are indeed, any dots in there, then we want to determine what the extension is, and otherwise we have no extension. So that's in the case that someone is loading just /about instead of /about.html, something like that. The next thing we need to do is, of course, in this current scenario, you might be loading localhost 1234, but you're not specifying localhost 1234/index.html. And because nobody really does that. Nobody types index.html anymore. But in this case, we want to serve the index.html file regardless. So that's what we're going to determine here if the request is to the root of the application. And if it is, then we will specify the path to have index.html in it. Otherwise, we'll use the URL. So if somebody requests the, logo.svg file, they can have that, and otherwise, we'll load index.html. So notice again, this is in the try block. So if any errors arise from the serve static file that we wrote in the responder.js, then we will catch the error and serve a different static file, which is error.html. And here we specify the status code of 500, and we specify the extension being HTML. So this is basically ready to run, actually. The last thing we need to do is make a simple edit to our app.js. But first, we should make one final change to the responder. So let's go back to the responder. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this concept, but MIME types. A MIME type is essentially a piece of information, a piece of metadata about something that you're sending to the browser that tells the browser how to open it. Now, it's simple enough to serve plain text, right? So it's anybody knows what that would look like. But if you're serving an image, for example, that's a different type of file format. Also, keeping in mind that there's many different image formats. So for example, the browser would need to know if you're trying to open a GIF or a JPEG, and depending on that, it will process it accordingly. So it would be a nice thing to do in order to make things a little bit easier on the browser if we return this MIME type header. It's actually called content type, so that's what we'll do next. So we'll implement content types. To do so, we're going to install our first module that we're actually going to use in the application itself. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about a module versus just a library versus a framework. Now, MIME types is not a framework. If you look at the documentation here, it does one really specific small thing, which is it determines, using the file extension, what the header should be for content type. So you're telling the browser that if you're requesting a JSON file, that it should tell the browser that the application.json is or /JSON is the content type. And there's a lot of them, and there's a massive amount of different content types. So yes, of course, you could reproduce the functionality of this particular library, but I personally find it easier to include it myself. You'll notice here that this is, for example, the library. So instead of having to redo this, like I said, it's probably easier to just use the library. So in order to install it, we need to run a simple little command, which is npm install MIME types --save. Now I'm not going to install it as a dev dependency, but I'm installing it as a regular dependency. And you'll notice it's a pretty small package, so it doesn't install anything else alongside it. And using it is really simple, actually. So in our libresponder.js, that's this file here, let's also load in the lookup method from MIME types. Looking at the docs, that's actually how you use the library, so it's pretty simple here. You see that the mime.lookup is what does the looking up of the MIME type given the extension. So that's the method we want to use. Oops. Oops, I just closed my code window. So yeah, so let's use the functionality next. And it's basically 2 lines of code here. So we're using lookup to look up the extension, and if we don't have one, then we just throw a not found error. Like what I was saying earlier, whether the reason is that the MIME type is invalid or whatever, it really doesn't matter. A not found error, I think, is sufficient in order to communicate your point, which is that the file cannot be served to the user. So here, we're throwing the not found error. And then the last part of this, you may or may not recognize the syntax, but this is actually to return a header to the response. So response.writeHead, that's the feedback. That's the syntax. And the status code, if it's provided here, we override this. Otherwise, we send back a 200. And what is the status code? Well, or why do we do this? Because in our error, for example, we want to return a 500. So in this case, it's really useful to return that if we provide it. And here we say that the content type header should say the value of what MIME is. So if it's a .json file, it will return a MIME type of application JSON. All right. So here we go. That's pretty much feature complete. And the next thing we need to do, or the last thing we need to do, is to essentially open up our app.js file. And we don't need any of this stuff in here anymore because that was just for testing. And we need to include our HTTP initializer, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll write an import here, import server, initializers, HTTP. So then all we need to do is to do server like this, and here we go. Let's start the whole thing up. So if I did everything correctly, this server should now serve static files. Oh yeah, we don't have any static files. I was saying earlier you should populate your static file directory with some of the files that I provided. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for myself now. I downloaded the public folder. So let's go ahead and do that. All right. So there we go. So you'll notice here, first of all, this is an HTML page being served. The content of it is index.html. So that's the minus.is here. We're also serving an image here. That's the favicon.png. So it's right here. So yeah, basically any static file that matches this will be served properly. You'll notice that there's also XML files. So if we do browser config.xml, you'll notice that an XML file is indeed served as part of this. If you're curious what a browser config XML file is, by the way, it's to do with tiles for, I think it's some kind of Windows 10 thing, so that if you make an extension or shortcut for it, it'll appear properly. But anyways, so there's that file. I guess one file that we could also test server is, yeah, any of these PNG files. So favicon, what the favicon looks like. Yeah, so, and you'll notice here, what I was talking about MIME types, I'm looking at the requests made to the server. And you'll notice here that we're serving the favicon 32 by 32. And we are responding with a content type of image PNG because it's a PNG image. So we're reading this extension from the file, and we are responding with the correct image/PNG content type, so that Firefox or Chrome or whatever will know what to do with this file. Otherwise, it might get a little confused and serve your image as a text file, for instance. We don't want that. Anyways, that pretty much does it in terms of our static file server. So thanks for joining me for this stream. I'm sorry if it's a little bit amateurish. This is actually my first time streaming, so it's really awesome you can join. This is also my first online course, so I would love to hear your feedback. You can do that by contacting me on Twitter. My username is mtimofeev. Or you could use the Telegram channel for this course, which is frameworkless. So if you click this link from the slides, or you go to t.me/frameworkless, you go to this, basically this Telegram group. So feel free to join. That would be awesome, because I would love to hear your feedback on how today went. So the next iteration of this course, the next part, will be about dynamic content and templating. So we'll get into serving actual dynamic content to people and using, yeah, templates. So we're going to use handlebars. That's the templating library we're going to use. So we'll go into essentially using handlebars in order to render, yeah, useful content instead of just static files, because static files aren't really that fun. You can see today's code on GitHub. If you go to the frameworkless.js organization, you'll find a remind.ist repository. Here it is. And there's a branch called stage 1, and that is today's lesson. So all of the code is actually available in here in the lesson. And lastly, you can actually see a live version of it running online. it uses I'm using Heroku to host it, and it's on a free dyno, so sometimes it takes a minute. But you can basically view it as it is in GitHub right now, live, by going to part1.remind.ist. So yeah, so please, if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, if you liked it or you didn't like it, I'd love to know more about that. Yeah, you can reach me by using the Telegram group or the Twitter, my Twitter. So please go ahead and contact me if you want. Yeah, thanks again for joining me, and I hope this was somewhat informative. And yeah, let's do this again and go through dynamic content and templating. Yeah, I think that concludes the stream. So yeah, please join the Telegram group and let me know how things went. Okay, ciao.